and welcome to this episode of The Next Big Thing. My name is Christopher Gannatti, Global Head of Research at WisdomTree, and I am quite excited because I'm trying a number of different things today. There are a lot of great podcasts out there where sometimes you'll see people experienced podcast hosts do solo episodes. And I always wanted to give that a try, and here we are. And additionally, diving into the deep end, one of the things I love in my spare time is to try to read up and I call it attempt to understand quantum computing. And that is a more and more interesting topic for us and my team here at WisdomTree. And so talking about for the first time in a public setting, quantum computing, trying to bring some of what I think are the important ideas together and trying to do it in a way where first and foremost, we want to learn something. I want to learn something. I hope you want to learn something. It's not the easiest of topics. I promise you we're not going to be doing any math. We're not going to be doing any probability on the screen or anything like that. But at the same time, you do recognize that sometimes analogy and just thinking can only take you so far. So in the future, we certainly aim to bring experts and a lot more to bear on the subject. But as we sit here in October of 2025, it's been really an incredible year for many thematic topics, but quantum computing in particular has had an amazing period over, say, the last month or so, looking at, say, September of 2025. And one of the things I find fascinating, and I saw from a colleague a note just yesterday that Google, their quantum effort was buying a research effort, an effort to help their overall quantum aspiration from MIT. And the first sentence of their report basically said, in 2012, we started this journey or this mission. And the mission is to have a fault-tolerant, gate-based quantum computer. And I'll say that numerous times, but that is the technical parlance of quantum computer that can just work. I want it to simulate chemistry, it can do it. I want it to look at an encryption system, it can just do it. I want it to potentially simulate some experiments that might lead to interesting drug candidates in the future, it can just do it. So a universal, fault-tolerant, gate-based quantum computer, that's the technical term for the quantum computer that just works and is just better at certain types of calculation, that's another key detail, than classical computers. So this is an important concept to just always have in mind. That is not something that, as we sit the fourth quarter, the early fourth quarter of 2025, we haven't yet achieved that, but it would be incorrect, at least in my opinion, to say we've achieved nothing. These companies have been achieving, you look at Google's efforts starting in 2012, that's 13 years ago, doing numerous things, investing now at the scale of an Alphabet or an NVIDIA or an Amazon or a Microsoft, you can absolutely say, look at how much money they spend on AI and AI data centers, and then look at how much money they spend on quantum. The numbers are not remotely close. I think we all know that. But that doesn't mean these companies just completely don't care. It doesn't mean that quantum is unimportant. It just means that looking at the business world today, is AI a bigger opportunity? Is what they're doing with data centers a bigger opportunity? I think the answer is unequivocally yes. But you always have to be balancing the now with the future. And in some cases, the medium term or even the far future. Because if you don't do that, we've all seen the resurgence of Intel. But Intel went from an amazing company basically everywhere. It kind of missed the opportunity to be in the iPhone. Didn't necessarily capitalize, at least not early, in AI. Maybe they're having a course correction. But that's an example of what could happen potentially if you lose that focus on both the current, what you need to execute, and the medium to long term. So Google has been doing this 13 years according to them. But in 2012, I admit, wasn't paying attention. I know a lot of people listening probably weren't paying attention, weren't thinking of quantum computing. Maybe they were thinking, oh, they have these moonshot things. Who cares? But look, Waymo at one point was one of those moonshot things. I think a lot of people in numerous cities around the United States now absolutely care about Waymo, and so it's not the case that the moonshots always sit in the back and never come forward. Sometimes they do, and they can come forward. But what's fascinating now in October of 2025 is how often we're hearing announcements related to quantum computing. And one of the companies out there, it's a pure play company, IonQ. Now, IonQ gets an enormous amount of attention for doing a variety of acquisitions. Of late, they had regulatory clearance for Oxford Ionics acquisition, which is a UK trapped ion base oriented technologies. And ultimately, you could sort of say, think of it like converting a local dialect into English so that your message can travel more globally. The ions maybe only speak in a certain frequency, but the fiber that they're traveling along kind of expects something that looks more similar to telecom. And you need to convert the frequency to translate. And this is a very technical thing. I'm sure it sounds that way. It feels that way to me as a non physicist. But what it is it keeps giving me that realization that if we're sitting here expecting the universal gate-based fault-tolerant quantum computer, and we're expecting that to happen, and that's why we're getting excited, we're losing an appreciation for a lot of these smaller technical steps that need to occur between where we are today and, again, this future state where the computers just worked. The advantage is just obvious. Another thing that I personally found interesting about IonQ was a different acquisition, a deal to acquire Vector Atomic. This was an entry into quantum sensing. Quantum sensing, I want to dedicate a little bit of time in sort of the second half of the talk today to the idea of quantum sensing, because you have this idea of quantum sensing, you have this idea of quantum communication. This is something that's different than trying to build a quantum computer. I think ultimately it's all important. And like anything else, what you have to do is you have to always be thinking, well, what are you going to use it for? If your expectation is not aligned with what the technology can do, then you're just going to look at it and be perennially disappointed. But if your idea is, for example, and I'll sort of tease this out and then we'll come back to it. If you think of the systems that allow us to know where we are on planet Earth, GPS, global positioning satellites. I read an article fairly recently, because we know that unfortunately there is still the Ukraine conflict with Russia, and Russia does a variety of things, not all of which are fully understandable as someone sitting in the West, with drones and other things. But I was reading this article about a flight, and I noticed it in particular because it was a United Airlines flight. That was the example they were using. And the route was from New Delhi in India to Newark in the United States, Newark, New Jersey. And the reason it caught my eye was I've actually taken that flight. And it was basically detailing how, because of quote unquote spoofing the GPS, I think that's the word that was used, what Russia was doing was messing up the perception that the pilots would have based on their instruments that are using the GPS satellites and the other kinds of things that planes use, the transponders. And they thought the plane was in a particular location in the air, and the plane was actually in a bit of a different location in the air. Now, in this particular case, the plane actually did make it to Newark. Obviously, in your worst case, the plane flies somewhere, it runs out of fuel, and no one survives. That is your worst case scenario. That did not happen here. The plane got a bit off course, ultimately got back on course. You got on your way. But as you sort of think about the future of warfare, the future of defense, which are other big topics for WisdomTree, something that you'll hear people say is, what if in the early stage of a conflict, people took out the GPS satellites? And admittedly, I'm using the GPS satellites. Like if I'm going to the dentist, I fire up the GPS because I want to know, like, is there traffic? Do I need to take a slightly different route? I'm going to the dentist every 6 months. I might not exactly remember the route, or there might be construction. So I'm a fail safe guy. I like to have the GPS up, and you're walking around in a new city. You may not even be in the car. You may just be walking from one location to another. Not every city is like New York City with a nice grid, and so GPS is, I'd say, pretty important to the living of everyday life. What if in the first stage of a conflict, a missile just takes out the GPS for an entire country? Now, that's obviously not as bad as a missile takes out a city, but at the same time, it would create an awful lot of disruption. A lot of people wouldn't know where they are, how to get around. It would be highly problematic. And so, quantum sensing, it was interesting to read about this. It could provide sort of a backup. You wouldn't want to be using it all the time, but it's sort of the concept that instead of just saying we've got GPS or we've got nothing, in this case you've got GPS. If something happens where the GPS may not be working, it might be jammed, it might have another problem, quantum sensing can ultimately come into the discussion. Another thing that IonQ did, and the reason I wanted to mention this, now, sometimes companies do put their own terminologies on some of these topics. So frequently in the world of quantum computing, you hear the word qubits. And frequently what people want to do is they want to put a number in front of the word qubits, and they want to see a bigger and bigger and bigger number. Why? Well, we've been trained. If you think Moore's law, and you think there's a certain number of transistors on a chip, and roughly 18 to 24 months at a nice cadence there from, call it 1965 or so, to a period quite recently. And I know, people like Jensen Huang are going on podcasts and saying Moore's law is dead and all that. So it doesn't quite work the same as it did in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. But the gist of it was, more transistors on a semiconductor are better. Each year, you want to hear about the new chip, the better performance, the more capabilities. And that usually coincided and was highly correlated to saying there's more transistors. And so we're trained, okay, more qubits must be better. Well, and we're going to get into some of these distinctions, but essentially there's the word qubits. Then frequently what people will do is they'll say physical qubits, which is just qubits, or logical qubits. Logical qubits are something that you can do calculations and extract interesting, valuable information from. And so a key question, if you're sitting there interested in this topic, thinking, I saw a headline, and this is sort of a paradigm I was thinking when organizing this talk in my head, and this is admittedly what I do. I'll see a headline. I'm not going to immediately know every aspect of what it means. I do want to know, and I want to keep learning, what questions can I ask, either to very knowledgeable people that I can meet along the way, or these different AI assistants, we'll call them, the Geminis, the ChatGPTs, etc., that exist in the world, where, look, no person knows everything. The AI systems don't know everything, but if you ask the right questions, you can zero in. And so asking about logical qubits whenever you hear or see a headline about just qubits in general is a very useful thing to do. You're going to get interesting information. What IonQ did, and this happens with a lot of companies, is they said, we hit the AQ 64 milestone ahead of plan on our tempo system. Which, look, being ahead of plan, that's where you want to be. A lot of these systems, you have to think, we're not talking about something that's going to be ready in a couple of months. We're not talking about something, in some cases, that's going to be ready in a couple of years. We're talking about engineering journeys that are hitting milestones where we may not know for sure if everything is going to work as planned for 3 or 4 years, maybe longer, depending if there are delays. And so being ahead of plan, that's really one of the key things that you want to zero in on and you want to see. But when you see AQ, I admit, It may be an industry term. I've never seen it outside of IonQ's material, so there is a chance that is a term they're using, and tech companies do this all the time. They've come up with a term that illustrates something important to them, doesn't always mean it's important to the entire industry. So AQ stands for algorithmic qubits. It's IonQ's proprietary metric meant to be more meaningful than just the number of qubits. And it's combining the count, which we were talking about, gate fidelity. We're going to talk a bit about gates a little bit later in this discussion, but that's an important word that I certainly want to flag: connectivity and error rates into a single number. So what's nice about algorithmic qubits is it is incorporating measures of very important things, all of which you need to know at least something about. This idea of errors, this is really the key to the whole kingdom. If we're saying we want to build, because what do we say? A fault-tolerant, universal, gate-based quantum computer. When we're saying fault-tolerant, what we really mean is there are errors that show up as we're running algorithms and calculations, but if the system can account for those errors and correct them in the appropriate way, such that it doesn't mess up the fidelity of the calculation, we're still in the game. We're still able to show quote unquote quantum supremacy and potentially in the future, not today, but in the future, do things that current classical computers cannot do. And that is really the name of the game. If people are out there and they have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the expertise, IonQ's system is deployed. And this is something to have in mind because sometimes people wonder, well, what are these companies doing? If there is no actual computer, fully fault tolerant, gate based universal quantum computer, if it doesn't exist today, why is there an IonQ? Why is there a Rigetti? Why is there a D-Wave? Well, these companies frequently are getting what they have available today, which are systems at varying degrees of maturity, to allow different types of researchers, governments, defense departments, all sorts of entities to access them. And frequently, they access them just like they're accessing cloud software. There's something called Amazon Bracket. So people listening might have heard of Amazon Bracket. What is Amazon Bracket? It's a gateway through AWS, Amazon Web Services, that you can use and then gain access to a lot of the pure play, what you'd think of as the pure play quantum computing, more startup oriented companies. And it's one way that if you're interested in quantum algorithms and experimenting and figuring out what can be done and what's the current state of the art, you can actually spool up different things and test different things and see how these environments are changing, even before, again, the full quantum computer is ready. So that's an important thing to just have in mind if you're thinking. Microsoft Azure has their own version of being able to access this. Google Cloud as well has their own version. So the hyperscale cloud players, it's not their main business. So don't expect to see a key report in the next earnings call in a few weeks or anything like that. But it is something important to note, and something for us as people following the space. One of the ways that people may gain access, because it's hard to conceive that regular people are just going to be buying quantum computers just like they bought laptops or they bought desktops back in the day. Quantum computers may be something where you're accessing over the internet, and you're using your classical computer to direct a quantum system in the future to do something, and then you're getting the answer back in a similar sense. The experience might, and the user interface might feel very similar to how we use large language models, which in 99% of cases are not being run on the local computer. They're being run in the cloud, and the answer is being beamed back to you over the internet. And so that may be an important direction in which we're ultimately heading. Now, we have to talk about more companies than just IonQ. But if you're thinking about IonQ and you're saying, what's the bottom line? IonQ is extremely diversified in the sense that through acquisition, in many cases, they've got their effort to build the universal fault-tolerant gate-based quantum computer. They've got their effort to be a player in quantum sensing. They've got their effort to look into quantum communication. So essentially, IonQ has their fingers in a lot of different pies in the quantum space. You like that when you're analyzing a company because you're thinking, okay, it's deeply uncertain, it's deep technology, it's early stage, so it's possible that IonQ, if they manage their capital well and they have the appropriate discipline in the right areas, they're giving themselves multiple ways, multiple avenues to take advantage of the advances in quantum technology as and when they occur. So we can sort of take IonQ, we can put it aside, and we can say very diversified player in the space. Now, D-Wave just came off a big conference. D-Wave is a separate quantum company. I learned something over the last year. So again, part of what we're doing here is saying, what are the vocabularies, the key words to use if you're seeing something about D-Wave and you want to compare D-Wave to IonQ or any other company? What is one of the most important words that I learned over the past year? It was the idea of quantum annealing, which is not the same as building a universal fault-tolerant gate-based quantum computer. It's a bit of a different approach. It's an approach where you can actually run optimizations and certain kinds of simulations today. It's not as flexible as the universal system could be in the future. But for certain kinds of problems, you're getting actual interesting and impactful results today. And there is a lot of discussion about how D-Wave's systems can work with, or at least within the context of high performance computing systems. And you're starting to see more and more the idea of, I've got my artificial intelligence over here, and I've got my D-Wave system, quantum annealing, over here. And I'm using the combination of these two things to attack certain interesting and potentially impactful problems, and hopefully getting better answers to those problems. So the key words that anytime you see a headline, anything about D-Wave, is if you're looking to dig in further, whether asking very knowledgeable people or asking AI assistants, searching the internet, whatever you might do, quantum annealing. I didn't know that term at the start of the year. I know it now, and it did unlock a lot of interesting information relevant and pertinent to D-Wave that I didn't know before. Now, if you say, what did D-Wave do recently? They recently had Qubits Japan 2025, which is a conference. It was their first user conference in Japan. The theme was Quantum Realized. And they have a sort of big proof of concept customer where they're working with Japan Tobacco, they're working with NTT Docomo, and they're bringing this idea of quantum annealing to certain problems that relate to drug-like molecular candidates. And it is important to step back and think about the kinds of things that are currently where we as a society hope quantum computing may be extremely helpful. Drug discovery is one of those areas because you step back and you realize we have organisms. Human beings are an organism. My dog sitting on the floor next to me is an organism. There are the organisms we see. Then there are the organisms that we don't necessarily see, single-celled organisms, bacteria. Unfortunately, there are such things as viruses. And you can keep getting smaller and smaller. You can think of, individual proteins. You can think of individual amino acids. And there was a lot of discussion of the AlphaFold system that DeepMind developed, where the amazing aspects of what they were able to achieve. Training a system, if you think about it, I think in the article I read, the estimation of the ways in which the ways in which the amino acids could come together and form a shape. And you think of how many shapes can ultimately be formed based on the known proteins. And we're basically saying, okay, the amino acids can come together like this, and then they can come together like this, and they might come together like this. So the amount of combinations that can lead to a unique shape, I think the figure in the article was 10 to the power of 300. It was one of those, it's whatever the number is, it's more than the number of atoms in the known universe. And if you're sitting there and you're thinking the computer needs to test every single one to find the answer, and this is sort of an example of serial computing where you're just saying test, no, test, no, test, no. And you're going in a very linear format. That's what serial computing looks like. And to attack a problem like that with serial computing, it's basically impossible. You can't do it. Now, what DeepMind did was they applied machine learning, artificial intelligence, certain kinds of things similar to how they attacked gameplay like AlphaGo and AlphaZero with chess and Go and things of that nature. They were able to use AI and get to a very, very interesting place and ultimately solve that aspect of the problem. Now, I'm careful to say that aspect of the problem because as you track the space, what's fascinating is even solving that aspect of the problem, it didn't occur, 1 month later, we've cured 5 diseases. Another month later, we've cured 10. It didn't work that way. Biology doesn't work the same way that software works. One of the things I feel like that spoils us when we're thinking about deep technology is we'll see ChatGPT come out in November of 2022, and 2 months later, there's 100 million people using it. And a few months after that, they release GPT-4, and it's everywhere. And now we're all talking about artificial intelligence. And it's almost like, well, how can you not be using artificial intelligence? It moves very, very quickly. But if you think of CRISPR and doctors Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier and how it was around 2012 that they're writing the paper about the CRISPR technology, which can cut the DNA in very specific locations. And that could be very useful if you can read DNA just like you read anything else and basically say, here's the problem. We're going to cut out the problem. We're going to put in the solution. Conceptually, it sounds simple, but the Nobel Prize for that, I think, was in 2020. So it was about 8 years after the paper was written. And it wasn't until I think it was the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, that the first therapy that had to do with sickle cell system, where you essentially have red blood cells that are misshapen, the first therapy using CRISPR was FDA approved and approved by the equivalent of the FDA over in the UK medical system. But you basically say 10 or 11 years to get the first fully approved drug regimen that actually uses CRISPR to something that helps humanity. So in software, 2 to 3 months, 100 million people using it. In biology, frequently you hear about these therapies. You might see in the journal Nature, the journal Science, other places. And then usually in the same article, it's like, well, the one aspect is each therapy costs $1.2 million. So that's also another issue that is beyond the realm of this podcast. But you're basically sitting there saying, man, biology is hard. And one of the things that you'll hear whenever you hear Demis, I try to listen anytime Demis Hassibis, the head of DeepMind, speaks. I try to listen. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, what are they trying to use AlphaFold for now? And it feels like they're progressing in the direction where they want to simulate how a cell works. And my hypothesis, I don't get to speak to them or anything, but my hypothesis is they then want to start to simulate more and more complex organisms, get to a point where you can simulate a human being to the point where maybe clinical trials, you still have to do them, but maybe some parts of clinical trials or more potentially dangerous clinical trials on certain drugs can be done in simulation. The issue that we're finding is when you're getting into smaller and smaller units, when you're going from the amino acids to the individual atoms, and individual atoms are not actually the smallest of particles. You can keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And if those underlying interactions are actually important, which they probably are, and you want to simulate all of them in an accurate enough way to mean something, that's where the benefit comes from having a universal gate-based fault-tolerant quantum computer, which we don't currently have. So it's not a case. It's basically we're on a road, and the hypothesis that we'd say we have is what AlphaFold was able to do is important. The potential of what quantum computers will be able to do in the future is important. And it's really the highest chance of success could only come if you're maximizing both of those avenues and having them work together. And so when I see a headline, D-Wave working with Japan Tobacco, and looking at the idea of AI for drug discovery, that's in my head. That's what I'm thinking. Now, when you read the article or you go online and you say what's going on, you're not going to get all of that color. All of that color comes from trying to keep up with the space, reading the background on all these different topics, because one of the things I'm trying to do is trying to have that deeper appreciation for the fact that most headlines we see in quantum computing now are steps on a journey. And part of what I feel like I have to do is figure out what the journey is, figure out how to evaluate where we are on the journey. And part of what we have to do is figure out what the actual headline means. And the fact that, look, if we've got multiple different efforts attacking a problem as complex as drug discovery in a myriad different ways, this is really going to give us as a society the best overall chance, in my opinion anyway, of ultimate success. NTT Docomo, not a drug discovery application, but something that they were doing with D-Wave a bit different, was a quantum optimization pilot for Docomo's mobile network. And the key result was a 15% reduction in essentially congestion during peak call times at the different base stations. And D-Wave's hybrid quantum solver solved in roughly 40 seconds versus classical methods taking something closer to 27 hours, these things. Now, you wouldn't necessarily say, okay, they've solved it, and this is how we do phone networking or database networking going forward. That is not the interpretation. The interpretation is it's another proof point, another validation, another fact that we can put up on the board that what D-Wave is pursuing, what they're testing, what they're working with these large enterprises and large companies on, is still showing signs of positive progress. And showing in deep tech like this, one of the most important things is you have to keep showing signs of positive progress. The real killer is if you've got no further signs of positive progress at all. That's a real problem. But no one is necessarily expecting, oh my gosh, they've done it, they've solved it, at least not in 2025. And we're going to there's actually an incredible published roadmap that I want to discuss in today's talk that ultimately tells us how to gauge where we might expect to be in different years with quantum computing. But D-Wave, if people have looked at the share price, it's moved. And one of the reasons it's moved is they were able to announce an 83% increase in year-over-year bookings growth in the Asia Pacific region. I think a lot of that is coming from, if you book a deal with Japan Tobacco and you book a deal with NTT Docomo, these are big Japanese companies. You wouldn't necessarily say there's 1,000 or so different customers of that size. Those companies are large enough that you're going to get a significant impact. Now, Rigetti, another pure player in the quantum space, they were able to win a $5.8 million Air Force Research Lab contract And the key is always you want to be thinking, what does that really mean? Well, Rigetti is very well known and very very good at progressing research efforts in the quantum computing space, and the fact that the U.S. government and other governments around the world continue to be interested in seeing what they're doing and willing to pay for it is quite important. But again, you don't want to look at that and say, "Oh my gosh, they've done it. They've got a universal fault-tolerant gate-based quantum computer." They don't. They're progressing in that direction. In this case, they're working towards quantum networking. When I hear networking, of course, in today's world, sitting in October 25, you step back and you think of the NVL 72, basically the NVIDIA system where you've got the Grace Blackwell chips, 72 of them networked together, and they're basically using the very, very unique connection systems that NVIDIA has deployed through the Mellanox acquisition and other supremely strong technologies that they've brought to bear. And this is how they're basically delivering AI training and AI inference at scale. And you step back, and one of the things, admittedly, I was thinking at the beginning of the year was, you hear about these chips. There might be 100, 120, 130 qubits. Why don't they just connect them together? Now, I'm not a quantum physicist. I don't have a background in the space. That was a rabbit hole that I started diving down. And long story short, it's not easy to just connect quantum chips together. It's actually not easy to connect GPUs together. We've figured out how to do it. It's potentially one of the biggest engineering problems that we have solved as a society. This concept of we can connect 500,000 GPUs together and have them communicate in such a way that we get useful results. Like that is fascinating in and of itself. But we did not roll out of bed knowing how to do that. And we are at an earlier stage. The way I would describe it is we're at an earlier stage of the game in quantum, where maybe if we can prove that we connect a few systems together, certainly not hundreds or hundreds of thousands yet, but there's no reason. I mean, look, back in the year 2000, the idea of a data center like we talk about today, it was impossible. And that's only 25 years ago. There is the famous postulate by Roy Amara, or at least attributed to Roy Amara. We hope for or expect too much in the short term, and then our expectations are frequently too low in the long term. So it could be amazing where we end up in quantum computing in not that long. But the next couple of months, you may not see any changes. You don't want to get discouraged. Now, another important area, I haven't touched on it yet. It might be one of the most important areas because if we think about the fuel for AI, and we're seeing hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars spent on AI powering today's economy. A lot of people say that if there's a quote unquote problem, meaning the AI train, if we're saying equity markets around the world are being influenced, driven, pushed higher in many cases because of certain aspects of the AI train pulling us up the mountaintop. If that actually is proven to be untrue, or we go into a trough of disillusionment, however you want to say it, that's going to be a big problem for global equity markets around the world at this point as we sit in the fourth quarter of 2025. But you then say, what's the fuel for AI? The fuel for AI, people frequently say, is data. Data is the new oil. There's all those euphemisms and statements that people can make. Well, data needs to have a certain amount of integrity for it to mean anything. Data, depending on what it is, if it's personal data, if it's health data, if it's a person's monetary data, financial data, bank data, what's the first thing you want? The first thing you want is security. And cybersecurity is, of all the different megatrends we track at WisdomTree, to give you a sense of the scale here, quantum computing is one of the megatrends that we track. I think we track currently 47. If we think of the ETF landscape, which is split largely between the US and the non-US markets, and we say how much money really is in the combination of quantum computing, strategies. It's probably between 2 billion and 3 billion USD as of this recording. It has been growing significantly this year. If we think of cybersecurity, much bigger topic, you could probably put a 10x multiple, thinking globally what the AUM in quote unquote cybersecurity strategies broadly would be. Probably it's probably over 20 billion in total. And then you say, well, what about artificial intelligence? How much money is in that? And that probably doubles what you see in cybersecurity. And you could even argue that are certain people investing in certain benchmarks like the NASDAQ 100 and thinking about AI as the main reason for doing so? Absolutely. So you can look at how people are voting with their assets, and there's a recognition that cybersecurity is incredibly important. AI is incredibly important. Quantum offers something very interesting on the security front, in the sense that if you do quantum safe encryption, which does exist, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US has put out at least a few different quantum safe encryption methodologies. So when I say quantum safe encryption, it's not that, well, we got to wait for that as well. No. We don't need to wait for that. That does exist. Companies, entities, service providers, they can opt to use quantum safe encryption now. They may want to do so because there is a hacker thing out there where what hackers are doing, at least some of them, is gathering data that they can't read, they can't decrypt, but they're betting that quantum computers, because essentially you can have quantum safe encryption, but at the same time, quantum computers, through the use of Shor's algorithm, may be able, if we do have that, again, universal fault-tolerant gate-based quantum computer, if we do have that, we may be able to run Shor's algorithm. We may be able to break things like RSA 2048. And if you think, what is 2048? Well, it's a 2048-bit number. I sort of went down the rabbit hole and said, well, I don't know what a bit, admittedly, I'm not a programmer, so I don't know what a bit is just off the top of my head in terms of how do I translate that to what a number would look like on the screen. A 2048-bit number would be roughly 617 digits. And if you're saying we want to figure out the prime factors, or at least two prime factors of such a number, you're figuring out, okay, I'm going to multiply a 300 plus digit number by another 300 plus digit number to get this precise result. And if you have current computers in the classical sense doing this, they estimate it could take thousands of years, more years than you would be alive to care about the results of the answer. But quantum computers, now the key, and we talked about before, what are some of the keys? It's not just qubits. It's you need a certain number of logical qubits that are stable enough so that you can run Shor's algorithm. You can run it for the appropriate length of time needed to get to the answer, which again is the two 300 plus digit numbers that you multiply together to get the 617 digit number. You cannot do that today with Google's Willow chip with, I believe, 105 qubits. That is certainly not going to work. There is no system today that can break with regularity RSA 2048 encryption, at least no known system. I don't know what the NSA or the governments have that's under the classified lock and key. But the key thing to have in mind here is when you see a company like Arkit, and you see Arkit is selected for UK's National Cybersecurity Centre PQC pilot, this is something where it's a signal that the government, in this case the UK government, is getting serious about helping organizations transition from classical encryption algorithms like RSA or ECC, elliptical curve cryptography, to quantum resistant ones. It's not impossible to do this. They do exist. They are around today, and it is something to just have in mind. You might hear people talk about something called Q Day. Q Day is the day where the quantum systems can actually, with consistency and regularity, run Shor's algorithm to break the encryption methods that we currently have. And so that's an important thing to just have in mind. If you hear the word Q day, that is not today. That is most likely not tomorrow. You can find all sorts of different probabilistic forecasts of when different experts think it might ultimately occur. But it's, again, one of those things where you want to have in mind this idea of the fault tolerant, universal, gate based quantum computer. And I know I've mentioned it numerous times, but one of the things we're able to now do is think about, okay, when is it that we should expect this system to be available? Or at least when might we allow such a system to exist? And I would recommend anyone who's interested in this topic, they go to IBM's website. There is something called the Quantum Technology Roadmap. Anyone can see it. It's publicly available. I get excited by these things because a company like IBM, it has a storied history. It's been around for 100 plus years. It's done so many different things. It's had its ups. It's had its ups. It's also had its not so ups moments. But they are making progress in quantum computing, and they put a roadmap together that they don't have to do. The SEC does not require in the quarterly documents to, tell us when they think they'll be able to do this or do that. So if they're confident enough to put this up on the website and to tell us what were they doing from 2016 to 2019, for example, well, they ran quantum circuits on IBM's quantum platform. What were they doing in 2020? A lot of us were dealing with the pandemic. They released multi-dimensional roadmap publicly with initial focus on scaling. And you can see as you go across the page, you see these different green checks. They have green checks all the way to 2024, last year, where they demonstrated an accurate execution of a quantum circuit at a scale beyond exact classical simulation. It was 5,000 gates on 156 qubits. And so essentially, they've got green checks through 2024, not yet for 2025. They're trying in 2025, and I know it's the fourth quarter, so we'll have to see and keep coming back to this site. In 2025, they're aiming to deliver quantum plus high performance computing tools that will leverage Nighthawk, and they use the names of birds ultimately for their different stages on this journey. So Nighthawk is a key stage on the journey, a key processor, a new higher connectivity quantum processor able to execute more complex circuits. So it's important to note, they are not saying we're going to solve it all in 2025. They're actually saying, if you look at this roadmap, and so frequently what we have to do when we're trying to invest in, again, in newer, deeper technologies, we have to say, what's a reasonable expectation that we can have out there so that if we're thinking about when such a universal quantum computer could be available, knowing that we cannot necessarily get our own physics PhDs and literally study the entire space, how do we inform a reasoned estimate? Well, IBM has put on the board here in 2029 their aim to deliver a fault-tolerant quantum computer with the ability to run 100 million gates on 200 logical qubits. And this is, again, one of the more important statements that we will make today. And the concept here of gates versus qubits is one of the most, in my opinion, important concepts that you can have in the space. And I think what we first have to do is we have to think, well, what is a gate? In classical computing, it is a logical operation, and, not, or, these kinds of things. These are the kinds of things where you're working along your Excel document where you're basically getting it to say, well, if the number is bigger, I want to see this, and if the number is smaller, I want to see that. And you're kind of getting the model to do. And there are some people that I know, my wife is one of them, where the Excel formula can go multiple different lines and it's doing many things. I admit my Excel formulas do not go multiple different lines, but you can have sort of a certain depth or a certain number of different operations you're trying to perform with a given formula. And one way to measure that is the number of gates you're using in that particular formula. For classical computing, we don't even think about it because the systems are stable enough that who cares how many gates? It's if you do it correctly, it's going to work. For quantum systems, where one of the things that we're trying or attempting is how do we get the qubits to be able to hold the information so that we can do useful things with them for longer and longer and longer periods of time. And if you think of this sort of as a progression, um, you're sort of thinking from first principles and saying, well, if you have one gate, can you do anything? Um, Having one gate is similar to just turning a coin from heads only to having it spinning in the air, where in the quantum world or in quantum terminologies, you ultimately will frequently say it is not a one or a zero as it is in the classical space. It is a combination of one and zero, and it's a probability of what you'll ultimately see. So with one gate, you really can't do that much. With 10 gates, you're maybe flipping two coins together, but you're really not doing that much. With 100 gates, you're starting to be able to use the system to have sort of early error mitigation experiments, small instances of quantum chemistry, but nothing all that exciting. Where we are today is we're getting into the between 1,000 and 10,000 gates. So if we think of, well, 10,000 gates, what can you do? Problems that classical computers can still simulate, but it starts getting more and more costly. But and this is one of the discussions that I wanted to make sure to hit on today is frequently one of the things that you'll see is you'll see someone claim quantum supremacy. I think in 2019 there were certain claims. There's always that desire to have the claim, because if you have the claim, you're going to get a lot of clicks. And quantum is no different than anything else. You want the attention, you want the clicks. Clicks might equal money in the future. But what you then usually see, if I subscribe to Nature and Science, you'll see a few months later, oh, it was actually found out that if you set up the classical algorithm in a certain way, you can actually get substantially the similar results. So you're not in a position yet where you're literally doing things that there's no, or I'll rephrase that. You're doing useful things that the classical computer could not also do if you had a good enough algorithm. But at a certain point, that changes. Now, IBM is saying, when is the point that that changes? It's in 2029 when you have the 200 logical qubits. Again, those are the qubits that are stable enough for you to do interesting and impactful things with them. And you have the capability to have an algorithmic depth of 100 million gates. That's telling us that the algorithms that you can run are of a complex enough nature where we're starting to get interesting results that might have to do with chemistry, that might have to do with drug discovery, that might have to do with lots of different things. And we couldn't get those same results no matter how good a job we did tuning our algorithms on the classical computer. So this is why people spend all this time talking about the universal gate-based quantum system. But if you walk away with anything from today's discussion, it's when is the logical time to sort of think about when that might occur. That is a 2029 thing. So what are we doing in 2025, 2026, 2027? What we're doing is we're monitoring the space. We're watching companies hit key milestones. Now, there isn't a guarantee that they couldn't do it sooner. Some companies might do it sooner. A company that we're not even paying any attention to might come out of nowhere and ultimately prove that they can do it. But as a base case, and if you're trying to say, how do you set a reasonable expectation? I like to go to a relatively long-standing conservative company like an IBM. I like to use that potentially as a base case, as opposed to a startup, which might very well get to the answer. But again, if I'm trying to set expectations, there's something to be said for going to what IBM is saying. If I'm trying to monitor the space, you're taking in any and all information and trying your best to parse it and ask the best, or at least better and better and better questions to learn more and more. And that's really what we're doing. I fully admit today, I don't know everything about this, but you want to keep learning, keep talking to people, keep using the tools that we ultimately have. Now, I've got my eye on the clock. I'll say the last overall big topic that we'll hit today, I wanted to just make sure to mention quantum modalities, at least a little bit, because what people might say is, why do there have to be so many companies? Why can't the big companies just, again, when I say the big companies, your Amazons, your Microsofts, your Alphabets, etc., why can't they just have a division? And in many cases, they do have a division, NVIDIA, and why can't they just do their stuff and figure this out? Well, A, they've got a lot of stuff of other stuff to do, and B, sometimes what you'll see is different entrepreneurs believing that the way to get to the universal fault-tolerant quantum computer is not the same. Some approaches, like those used by IBM, Google, and Rigetti, use superconducting qubits, which are tiny electrical circuits. This is where the idea of cooling something to near absolute zero. What's absolute zero? The atoms, the molecules are basically not even moving, not even vibrating at all. And essentially, you are watching those companies pursue that approach. But what's an issue with that approach? Well, it's really hard. If you're not in outer space, let's say, it's really hard to cool something down to near absolute zero. Trapped ions, well, IonQ, you can see it in the name, quantinuum. These are individual atoms or ions trapped in electromagnetic fields and manipulated with lasers. The qubits themselves are very stable. They have long coherence times and high fidelity operations. And you might hear and look, when you saw that announcement with the algorithmic qubits, IonQ, influencing how investors perceive IonQ along with their different acquisitions and everything in September of 2025, it's not outlandish to hear that the gates that use trapped ions are the most stable, the most accurate in the industry, and they can connect qubits across modules using optical means. And when you say optical means, usually that's lasers and lights. But what they haven't done yet doesn't mean they won't do it. It's just they haven't yet demonstrated large-scale error correction to be able to run those systems of logical qubits. They do not currently have a means. So again, what was IBM saying? They were saying 200 logical qubits, 100 million gates. Even if this approach is interesting, exciting, and they're getting a lot out of it, they don't yet have even those levels. Photonic qubits, if you see PsiQuantum or Xanadu, these are qubits encoded in photons traveling through optical circuits. What's an optical circuit? It's similar to a fiber optic cable that I remember I was learning about connecting to the internet in the year 2000, and fiber optic was all the rage. The benefit of photonic qubits, room temperature operation. So you don't need absolute zero. So that's good. And you can get massive scaling, or at least potential for massive scaling, using silicon photonics in manufacturing. However, the loss, the inefficiencies, the detectors that are needed, this approach as yet, again, you basically say, can they do 200 logical qubits, 100 million gates? They cannot yet do that. They may get there, but again, not where they are today. You might hear of Rydberg atoms, neutral atoms excited into Rydberg states with lasers, making them interact strongly with each other. And so you basically step back and you say, okay, you can use ions, you can use superconducting states, you can use photons, you can use specially treated atoms. What you learn as you go through the list here is, it's almost like, what can you not use? If you knew how to manipulate it, if you knew how to deal with it, what can you not use in the world? companies like Pascal and Q-era use these Rydberg atoms, but again, they have not yet gotten farther and farther down the path. And if we use the IBM roadmap as a measure, they're not yet there. Now, I did want to make sure to mention topological qubits and Majorana particles. And admittedly, when Microsoft was talking about this in February of this year, I immediately went out and there's a book you can actually read on Ettore Majorana, who was working at that time in Italy. He worked with Enrico Fermi, which obviously went on to fame with the Manhattan Project and fission. But Ettore Majorana, the thing that you find out when you read about him is he disappeared basically off a ship. He was going to a particular island off the coast of Italy and was just essentially never seen again. But he postulated the existence of a particular particle. And quantum mechanics, quantum physics, one of the most fascinating things. I personally love the history. It's probably about 120, 130 year history at this phase. And there are these periods like guys like Paul Dirac basically doing math equations and saying, well, there's a certain particle, we haven't seen it yet. It should exist because the math is just so beautiful that it has to exist. And he did that. So Paul Dirac did that. And he found the positron before he could even detect it. And it was essentially detected later. So such a thing as the opposite particle to the electron in that case did exist. Ettore Majorana was basically saying, okay, there should be this thing called a Majorana particle. And Microsoft is talking a lot about it. Why were they talking about it? Well, if you could do quantum computing in this way, it's almost like you solve all the issues immediately. You're not as worried about decoherence. You're not as worried about error correction because the errors don't creep in with anywhere near the same frequency as some of the other methods. Now, the tricky aspect, and again, as this is where the benefit comes from trying to subscribe and looking through science and nature, there's been a lot of debate on what experiments were done. Can they be recreated? Did you actually see a Majorana particle or a topological qubit? Can you actually prove that such a thing existed? It's a current area of active debate. I honestly don't know one way or the other. I haven't seen, the show-stopping article that says 100% they've done it. So I certainly haven't seen that. But it's something to continue to monitor. And I keep personally thinking about a scene. If anyone's watched a scene in the show, the three body problem, where it basically shows the idea of a computer as people, millions of people arrayed across a desert, holding up either black or white cards, and this idea again of the one or the zero, the on or the off. And again, the classical system, what's it doing? It's just running a current over transistors. They're either on, they're off, ones and zeros. That's it. Simple enough. These quantum machines are able to be one or zero or anything in between to infinity. And this is how they are able to use things like coherence and superposition to come up with really incredible calculations. As a society, we don't know which route. So these different modalities represent different routes, different viewpoints that different entrepreneurs have trying to get to the goal. We don't know which is going to get there, but we do know that it's worth trying. And with that idea, I want to recognize that, again, this was my first ever solo discussion. The numbers are going to be telling in the sense that if it's good, you'll see me do it again. And if it's not good, you'll never see me do it again. And that'll tell you, I guess the numbers, Chris, were not as good and people were not as enamored as you might be with the sound of your own voice. But with that, I do have to say, to clarify, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of WisdomTree and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. So please continue to interact with us at WisdomTree. I thank you all for listening. I thank you all for subscribing to the Next Big Thing podcast, and we'll look forward to coming back again soon.